The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Elena Vasquez stepped through the medical processing station doors, her boots clicking against the polished concrete floor. The antiseptic smell, mixed with nervous sweat from dozens of new recruits, filled her nostrils as she joined a line of young men and women waiting to begin their transformation into Marines. She rolled up her sleeves as instructed, revealing the intricate tattoo that covered most of her right forearm. The design was unmistakably military. An eagle perched atop an anchor, surrounded by detailed rope work and Latin text that few could read from a distance. The artwork was professionally done, each line crisp and bold against her olive skin. The medical technician barely glanced up as Elena approached his station. Corpsman Williams had processed thousands of recruits over the years, but when his eyes fell on her tattoo, he paused. His weathered face showed a flicker of recognition before returning to his clipboard. "Check your blood pressure here," he said, gesturing to the automated cuff. Elena complied silently, aware of the whispers starting behind her in line. "Look at Tattoo Girl," someone muttered. "Probably thinks she's already a badass." Elena kept her eyes forward, but her jaw tightened slightly. She had heard variations of this commentary her entire life. People saw the ink and made assumptions about who she was, what she represented, why she had chosen to mark her skin with military imagery. The blood pressure cuff squeezed and released. Normal readings across the board. Corpsman Williams made his notes, then looked directly at Elena for the first time. "That is some serious artwork," he said quietly. "Where did you get it done?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "My hometown in Arizona. Phoenix area." Before we continue with Elena's story, drop a comment and let us know what state you are watching from. Maybe military families are common where you live, or perhaps you have witnessed similar situations in your community. Corpsman Williams nodded slowly, his pen hovering over the medical form. He seemed about to ask another question when the line behind Elena grew restless with impatient shuffling and throat clearing. "Move along," someone called out. "We do not have all day." Elena gathered her paperwork and moved to the next station, but she could feel eyes following her. The tattoo had always been a conversation starter, though rarely the kind of conversation she wanted to have. Most people saw military imagery on a young woman and assumed she was trying too hard, playing dress-up with symbols she had not earned. At the uniform fitting station, Quartermaster Sergeant Lopez handed her a stack of camouflage utilities and boots. As Elena signed for her gear, Lopez glanced at her exposed forearm. "Nice ink," he said matter-of-factly. "You prior service?" "No, Sergeant," Elena replied. "This is my first enlistment." Lopez raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. He had learned not to judge books by their covers during his 20-year career. Still, the tattoo was remarkably detailed and authentic, looking for someone with no military background. Elena moved through the remaining stations with quiet efficiency, collecting dog tags, receiving initial briefings, and completing endless paperwork. At each stop, her tattoo drew attention. Some looks were curious, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. By the time she reached the barracks assignment desk, word had spread through the processing group about the recruit with the military tattoo. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, a lean man with cold gray eyes, looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "So you're the one everyone is talking about," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Let me guess. Daddy was in the service, and you think that makes you special." Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "No excuse, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds smirked. "We will see how special you really are, recruit. Grab your gear and find Rack 23 in Building C. Try not to let all that artwork slow you down." The barracks buzzed with nervous energy as 50 new recruits tried to navigate their first night in the Marine Corps. Elena found Rack 23 nestled between two other bunks in the center of the long, sterile room. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across olive-drab blankets and identical footlockers. She began organizing her issued gear with methodical precision, folding each item according to the diagram posted on the wall. Her movements were confident, practiced, as if she had done this routine countless times before. "Hey, look who made it!" called out a voice from across the narrow aisle. Brandon Kellerman stood at his own rack, a cocky grin spreading across his square face. At 6 foot with broad shoulders and the swagger of a high school football star, he had quickly established himself as the unofficial leader of the more vocal recruits. Brandon gestured toward Elena's exposed tattoo as she arranged her uniforms. "Check it out, guys. We got ourselves a real warrior over here. Tell me, sweetheart, did you get that at some strip mall parlor to impress the boys?" Several recruits looked up from their own unpacking, sensing drama brewing. Elena continued folding her clothes without acknowledgement, but her shoulders tensed slightly. Zara Okafor, a tall woman with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work, glanced over from the adjacent bunk. She had noticed Elena's quiet competence during processing and felt a stirring of sympathy for the unwanted attention. "Leave her alone, Kellerman," Zara said quietly. "We all got enough to worry about without starting trouble." Brandon laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, I'm not starting trouble. Just wondering why someone would ink themselves up with military symbols when they have not earned the right. Seems pretty disrespectful to those of us with actual military family members." Tommy Chun, a slight young man with intelligent eyes, looked up from his own preparations. His father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he understood the weight of military tradition. Still, something about Brandon's aggressive tone made him uncomfortable. "Maybe there is more to it than you think," Tommy suggested carefully. Brandon shot him a withering look. "What, you think Princess over there is hiding some deep military secret? Look at her. Probably never been in a real fight in her life." Elena finally turned to face Brandon, her dark eyes steady and unreadable. She spoke in a calm, controlled voice that carried surprising authority. "My personal history is not up for discussion, recruit. I suggest you focus on your own preparation." The formal way she addressed him, using his rank rather than his name, caught Brandon off guard for a moment. Most recruits were still stumbling over military protocol, but Elena's delivery was natural, instinctive. Brandon recovered quickly, his grin widening. "Oh, we got a tough one here. Using proper military speak and everything. Did you practice that in the mirror, or did YouTube teach you how to sound all official?" The comment drew snickers from several nearby recruits who were eager to align themselves with Brandon's dominant personality. Elena turned back to her gear without responding, but her hands moved with slightly more force as she continued organizing. Staff Sergeant Reynolds appeared at the entrance to the barracks, his presence instantly commanding attention. Every recruit snapped to various approximations of attention, though most looked awkward and uncertain. "Listen up, maggots," Reynolds barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Tomorrow morning, you begin the real work of becoming Marines. Some of you think you already know what that means. Some of you think your daddy's service record or your tough guy tattoos make you special." His eyes found Elena in the crowd, lingering meaningfully on her tattooed forearm. "Let me be crystal clear about something," Reynolds continued. "Nothing you did before you stepped on my base matters. Nothing your family did matters. The only thing that matters is what you prove to me over the next 13 weeks. Some of you will discover you are not as tough as you thought. Some of you will surprise yourselves." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final point. "And some of you will learn that playing dress-up with military symbols does not make you a warrior. Actions make warriors. Performance makes Marines. Everything else is just decoration." The dismissal was clear, and Elena felt the weight of every gaze in the barracks. Brandon's smirk had returned, broader than before, and she could see him filing away Reynolds' words as ammunition for future encounters. As the lights went out and the barracks settled into restless quiet, Elena lay on her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. Her tattoo was hidden beneath her long sleeves now, but she could feel it against her skin like a warm reminder of everything she carried with her. Tomorrow would bring their first real test, and she knew the scrutiny would only intensify. The alarm shrieked at 0400 hours, jolting the recruits from restless sleep into the harsh reality of their first training day. Elena was already awake, had been for 10 minutes, listening to the breathing patterns around her and mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Physical training began in the pre-dawn darkness. 50 recruits stumbling through formation on the grinder outside their barracks. The concrete surface stretched endlessly under harsh floodlights, and the October air carried a sharp bite that cut through their issued physical training gear. Staff Sergeant Reynolds stood before them like a predator surveying prey, his eyes scanning the uneven ranks of nervous young people. Behind him, 3 other drill instructors waited with the patient menace of wolves. "Today you learn what your bodies are actually capable of," Reynolds announced, his voice carrying across the formation. "Some of you will discover hidden strength. Others will learn uncomfortable truths about your limitations." Elena stood in the second rank, her posture already showing the subtle signs of military bearing that most recruits would take weeks to develop. Brandon Kellerman noticed from his position 3 spaces to her left, and his jaw tightened with irritation. The physical training began with basic calisthenics. Push-ups, sit-ups, mountain climbers, jumping jacks. Elena moved through each exercise with fluid efficiency, her form textbook perfect and her breathing controlled. While other recruits struggled and gasped, she maintained a steady rhythm that suggested extensive prior conditioning. "Look who thinks she knows what she is doing," Brandon muttered during a brief water break, loud enough for nearby recruits to hear. "Probably spent months at some civilian gym preparing to show off." Zara Okafor, sweat beading on her forehead despite her own solid performance, shot Brandon a disapproving look. "She runs like someone who has been doing this for years," she observed quietly to Tommy Chun. Tommy nodded, wiping perspiration from his glasses. There is something different about her movement, natural like muscle memory. The observation was accurate. Elena's stride during their 3-meal run was economical and sustainable, her breathing pattern suggesting someone accustomed to much longer distances. When other recruits began to fade during the second mile, she maintained her pace effortlessly. Reynolds noticed too, running alongside the formation and studying each recruit's performance with calculating eyes. Elena's competence was undeniable, but it raised questions that made him suspicious rather than impressed. During the cool-down stretching, Brandon seized his opportunity to undermine her performance. He positioned himself near a group of struggling recruits who were still catching their breath and nursing sore muscles. "Must be nice to have all that fake tattoo motivation," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to ensure Elena heard. "Probably tells herself she is honoring some imaginary military family member while she shows off." Elena continued her stretching routine without visible reaction, but several recruits noticed her jaw muscles flex slightly. Tommy Chin looked uncomfortable with Brandon's persistent harassment, but the group dynamics were already establishing themselves around Brandon's aggressive personality. The morning training concluded with formation drills, basic movements that would become second nature over the coming weeks. Elena fell into step with the practiced ease of someone who had studied military bearing extensively, her alignment and timing superior to recruits who had been star athletes in civilian life. As they marched back toward the mess hall for morning chow, Staff Sergeant Reynolds fell into step beside Elena. His presence was intimidating, and several recruits glanced nervously in their direction. "Vasquez," Reynolds said without looking at her directly. "Where exactly did you learn to move like that?" Elena kept her eyes forward, maintaining proper military bearing. "I have always been physically active, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds studied her profile as they continued marching. "That was not civilian fitness, recruit. That was trained movement, disciplined breathing. Someone taught you those techniques." Elena felt the weight of attention from surrounding recruits, aware that this conversation would fuel more speculation and harassment. She chose her words carefully. "I have always taken physical training seriously, Staff Sergeant. My preparation was thorough." Reynolds made a non-committal sound that could have indicated satisfaction or suspicion. They reached the mess hall entrance, and he peeled away without further comment, leaving Elena to face the curious stares and whispered conversations of her fellow recruits. Brandon was already holding court at one of the long tables, his voice carrying across the dining area as he entertained his growing circle of followers. Did you see how cozy she got with Reynolds during that march? He said, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. Probably trying to use her little military costume to get special treatment. The comment drew knowing nods from recruits eager to align themselves with Brandon's dominant position in the social hierarchy. Elena took her tray to an empty section of seating, but the isolation felt more pronounced with each passing hour. She ate in silence, her mind focused on the challenges ahead, while around her the speculation about her background continued to grow. The combat training pit stretched 40 feet across, its sandy surface churned from countless hours of hand-to-hand instruction. Recruits formed a loose circle around the edge, their faces showing mixtures of excitement and nervousness as Gunnery Sergeant Martinez demonstrated basic grappling techniques on a volunteer. Elena stood between Zara and Tommy, her attention focused completely on the instruction. Her dark eyes tracked every movement, every subtle shift in weight and positioning that Martinez used to control his opponent. Around her, other recruits whispered and joked, but she absorbed the lesson with the intensity of someone studying a foreign language. Martinez was a compact man built like a prizefighter, his movements economical and precise. 20 years of Marine Corps combatives training had refined his technique to lethal efficiency, and he commanded absolute respect from even the most cocky recruits. Combat is not about size or strength, Martinez explained, releasing his volunteer and stepping back. It is about leverage, timing, and the willingness to do whatever necessary to survive. Some of you think you already know how to fight because you threw punches in high school. You are wrong. He scanned the circle of faces, his gaze pausing briefly on Elena before moving on to Brandon, who stood with his chest puffed out and arms crossed in a display of confident aggression. Fighting angry gets you killed, Martinez continued. Fighting scared gets you killed. Fighting smart keeps you breathing. Today, we learned the difference. The recruits paired off for basic drills, practicing the fundamental positions and transitions Martinez had demonstrated. Elena found herself matched with David Restrepo, a stocky recruit from Texas who had wrestled in college and carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to physical dominance. "Do not worry, Princess," Restrepo said with a condescending grin as they squared off. "I will go easy on you, since you are probably more used to showing off those tattoos than actually using your hands." Elena settled into a ready position that looked almost casual, her balance centered and her hands relaxed at her sides. Something about her stance made Restrepo hesitate for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The drill began with basic takedown attempts. Restrepo lunged forward with the bull-rushing technique that had served him well on high school wrestling mats. But Elena sidestepped with fluid grace and used his momentum to send him tumbling past her into the sand. "Lucky," he muttered, scrambling back to his feet with sand coating his uniform, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. They reset and tried again. This time Restrepo attempted a more controlled approach, but Elena read his intentions before he moved and countered with a hip throw that deposited him firmly on his back. The technique was textbook perfect, executed with the kind of timing that came from extensive practice. Gunnery Sergeant Martinez had been circulating through the training pairs, offering corrections and encouragement, but Elena's performance drew his attention. He moved closer, watching as she deflected another of Restrepo's increasingly frustrated attacks. "What the hell?" Restrepo gasped, wiping sand from his mouth. "Where did you learn to do that?" Elena helped him to his feet, her expression neutral. "Just following the instruction," she said simply. But Martinez had seen enough to recognize trained movement when he witnessed it. Elena was not just following instruction. She was applying principles she already understood at a fundamental level. Her technique showed hours of drilling, muscle memory developed through repetition and refinement. From across the training area, Brandon had noticed the commotion around Elena's practice session. He watched with growing irritation as Restrepo, one of his allies in the campaign of harassment, repeatedly found himself outmaneuvered by the quiet recruit with the mysterious tattoo. "Looks like Tattoo Girl has some moves after all," Brandon called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Probably learned them in some strip mall karate class where they hand out black belts with Happy Meals. The comment drew snickers from his supporters, but Martinez silenced the noise with a sharp look that could have melted steel. "Kellerman," Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Since you seem so interested in commentary, why do not you demonstrate your own technique?" Brandon's face lit up with opportunity. He had been looking for a chance to publicly humiliate Elena, and this seemed like the perfect opening. At 6 foot woe and 200 pounds of muscle built through years of football training, he was confident in his physical advantages. "I will be happy to show everyone how it is done, Gunny," Brandon replied with obvious relish. Martinez gestured for Elena and Brandon to move to the center of the circle. The other recruits gathered closer, sensing that this demonstration would be more significant than routine training. Elena walked to the center with calm composure, but those watching closely could see her hands flex slightly, as if she were mentally preparing for something more serious than a basic training drill. Brandon strutted across the sand like a gladiator entering the arena, playing to his audience of supporters. The firing range stretched across 200 yards of carefully maintained grounds, with concrete shooting positions lined up like uniformed tombstones under the morning sun. 50 recruits stood behind the firing line, each clutching an M16A4 service rifle that felt foreign and intimidating in their civilian-trained hands. Range Safety Officer Tompkins, a weathered staff sergeant with 30 years of experience, surveyed the nervous faces before him. His voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed countless accidents caused by overconfidence and inexperience. "Today you learn to respect your weapon," Tompkins announced, his tone leaving no room for casual attention. "This rifle is not a toy, not a prop, and not something you wave around to look tough. It is a precision instrument that can kill at distances most of you cannot even see clearly." Elena stood in firing position 12, her rifle held with proper muzzle discipline and her finger positioned safely along the trigger guard. Around her, other recruits fidgeted nervously, many holding their weapons with the awkward uncertainty of people handling dangerous tools for the first time. Brandon occupied position 8, close enough to maintain his running commentary, but far enough away to avoid direct confrontation with range safety protocols. He had been unusually quiet during the safety briefing, but his eyes kept drifting toward Elena with obvious anticipation. The morning would begin with basic marksmanship fundamentals: sight alignment, breathing control, trigger squeeze, and follow-throw. Most recruits would struggle to hit targets at 50 yards during their first attempt, and many would require weeks of training to achieve minimal competency standards. Tompkins demonstrated proper shooting stance, his movements precise and economical. 25 years of competitive shooting had refined his technique to textbook perfection, and he demanded nothing less from his students. "Your rifle becomes an extension of your body," he explained, settling into position behind a demonstration weapon. "You do not aim and hope. You align, breathe, squeeze, and follow through. Every shot is deliberate. Every round has purpose." The recruits attempted to mirror his stance, with varying degrees of success. Elena settled into position with fluid, natural movement, her body alignment suggesting someone familiar with weapon handling protocols. Her grip was confident without being tense, her breathing controlled and methodical. Tommy Chun, positioned to her right, noticed the difference immediately. His father had taught him basic shooting fundamentals during hunting trips, but Elena displayed the kind of systematic approach that suggested formal training. "You look like you have done this before," Tommy observed quietly during a brief instruction pause. Elena kept her attention focused downrange, but answered in the same neutral tone she used for most personal questions. "I have always believed in being prepared." The first live fire exercise began at 25 yards with large silhouette targets that should have been manageable for even novice shooters. Most recruits would be satisfied with hitting anywhere within the target area, and many would miss completely during their initial attempts. Elena loaded her magazine with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and confident. She settled into firing position, aligned her sights, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The shot broke cleanly, and even at 25 yards the impact was visible through binoculars. Center mass, precisely placed. She continued through her magazine with mechanical consistency, each shot following the same controlled sequence. When a ceasefire command echoed across the range and targets were retrieved for scoring, Elena's target showed a tight grouping that would have impressed experienced marksmen. Tompkins examined her target with growing surprise, then checked the number to verify the firing position. He had seen recruits achieve lucky shots before, but this was systematic precision that indicated extensive prior training. Vasquez, Tompkins called out, holding up her target for inspection. "Where exactly did you learn to shoot like this?" The question drew immediate attention from surrounding recruits, many of whom had struggled to hit their targets at all. Elena felt the familiar weight of scrutiny as eyes turned toward her with mixtures of surprise and suspicion. "I have always taken marksmanship seriously," Staff Sergeant Elena replied, maintaining proper protocol while offering minimal personal information. Brandon pushed forward to examine her target, his expression shifting from skepticism to obvious irritation. The tight grouping was undeniable evidence of skill that contradicted his narrative about Elena being all show and no substance. "Probably had private lessons from some mall ninja instructor," Brandon said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Money can buy training, but cannot buy real combat experience." Several recruits nodded in agreement, eager to align themselves with Brandon's interpretation rather than acknowledge Elena's genuine competence. The suggestion that her skill came from privilege rather than dedication helped maintain the comfortable fiction that she was fundamentally no different from them. Tompkins studied Elena with calculating eyes, clearly recognizing trained movement and systematic technique when he saw it. Her performance suggested hundreds of hours of practice under qualified instruction, the kind of foundation that required significant commitment and access to proper facilities. "We will see how you perform at longer ranges," Tompkins said, his tone neutral but watchful. Distance has a way of separating natural ability from actual training. Elena nodded respectfully, but those watching closely could see a flicker of something in her dark eyes. Confidence, perhaps, or the quiet assurance of someone who had been tested at distances far greater than anything a basic training range could offer. The morning progressed to 100-yard targets, then 200 yards, with each distance eliminating more recruits from competitive accuracy. The tactical training ground sprawled across 15 acres of carefully designed terrain, complete with mock buildings, defensive positions, and obstacles that simulated real combat environments. Squad-sized elements of recruits huddled around their designated starting positions, studying hand-drawn maps and listening to hurried strategy discussions. Elena knelt in the sand beside her assigned team, a mixed group of 8 recruits who had been randomly assembled for the afternoon's patrol exercise. The mission seemed straightforward on paper: advance through hostile territory, locate and secure a designated objective, then extract without casualties. Brandon commanded the adjacent squad, his voice carrying across the staging area as he outlined his aggressive approach to the problem. His team consisted largely of recruits who had gravitated toward his dominant personality, eager followers who nodded enthusiastically at his every suggestion. "We hit them hard and fast," Brandon declared, jabbing his finger at the map for emphasis. "Straight-line assault, maximum firepower, overwhelm any resistance before they can react." Simple and effective. Elena studied her own team's map with quiet intensity, her finger tracing potential routes and identifying key terrain features that could provide cover or concealment. While other squad leaders focused on direct approaches, she considered angles and alternatives that others had overlooked. Tommy Chun, assigned to her squad, noticed her methodical analysis. "What are you thinking, Elena?" he asked quietly. Elena pointed to a series of elevation changes that most recruits had dismissed as irrelevant obstacles. "If we approach from the northwest, we can use this ridgeline to mask our movement. Slower, but much safer than crossing open ground." Zara Okafor, also part of Elena's team, leaned closer to examine the proposed route. That adds almost 20 minutes to our timeline, she observed. The instructors emphasized speed as a primary objective. Elena met her gaze with steady confidence. Speed without security gets people killed. Better to arrive late than not arrive at all. The comment carried an authority that made the team pause. Elena was not just offering an opinion. She was stating a fundamental principle with the conviction of someone who understood its importance through experience rather than theory. Instructor Sergeant Martinez appeared at their position, clipboard in hand, as he reviewed each squad's initial planning. His weathered face showed no emotion as he listened to hurried explanations and nervous justifications from squad leaders. When he reached Elena's team, he found them engaged in detailed discussion about fields of fire, covered approaches, and contingency planning. The level of tactical thinking was notably more sophisticated than most recruit-level conversations. Vasquez Martinez said, studying her marked map with interest. "Explain your approach." Elena stood and oriented the map so Martinez could follow her reasoning. "We advance using covered routes to minimize exposure, establish overwatch positions before each movement phase, and maintain multiple extraction options throughout the operation." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like small unit tactics doctrine, recruit. Where exactly did you learn to think like that?" Elena felt the familiar tension that accompanied questions about her background, but she maintained her composed demeanor. "I believe in thorough preparation, Sergeant. I study everything I can about military operations." The explanation was technically accurate but deliberately vague, offering no real insight into the source of her tactical knowledge. Martinez seemed to recognize the evasion, but the exercise schedule prevented further investigation. The training began with squad-sized movements through varying terrain. Elena's team advanced with disciplined coordination, each member understanding their role in the larger tactical picture. Their progress was methodical and secure, though slower than the more aggressive squads charging across open ground. Brandon's squad, true to his personality, attacked each objective with direct frontal assaults that relied on speed and aggression rather than tactical sophistication. Their approach was loud, obvious, and ultimately effective in the simplified training environment. As the afternoon progressed, Elena's tactical instincts became increasingly apparent to anyone paying close attention. She anticipated enemy positions before encountering them, identified key terrain features that others missed, and coordinated her team's movements with the kind of systematic thinking that typically required years of military education. During a brief halt between objectives, Tommy found himself studying Elena with growing curiosity. The gap between her claimed civilian background and her demonstrated knowledge was becoming impossible to ignore. "Elena," Tommy said carefully, "where exactly did you go to school before enlisting?" Elena checked her weapon and equipment while considering her response. "Arizona," she said simply. "Public education, nothing special." The non-answer was becoming a familiar pattern, but Tommy pressed gently. "What about family? Anyone in the military who might have taught you some of this tactical stuff?" Elena's hands stilled for just a moment, and Tommy caught a flicker of something deeper in her expression. Pain, perhaps, or the weight of memories she preferred not to discuss. "My father served," Elena said finally, her voice carrying a subtle change in tone that suggested the topic was both important and difficult. Before Tommy could ask follow-up questions, the exercise resumed with new objectives and time constraints. But the brief exchange had revealed another piece of the puzzle surrounding Elena's mysterious competence and the significance of her carefully guarded tattoo. As evening approached and the training concluded, Elena's squad had successfully completed every objective with minimal casualties and maximum tactical effectiveness. The obstacle course stretched before them like a medieval torture device designed by sadistic engineers. 30 feet of rope climbs, wall scaling, tire runs, and crawling sections that would test every muscle in their bodies. The morning air carried the scent of sweat and determination as 50 recruits prepared for their most physically demanding challenge yet. Elena stood in formation with the others, her breathing steady and controlled despite the intimidation factor of the course ahead. She had studied the obstacles during their initial walkthrough, mentally calculating the most efficient approaches to each challenge. Staff Sergeant Reynolds positioned himself at the starting line with obvious relish, his cold eyes scanning the nervous faces before him. This was his favorite training event, the one where recruits discovered uncomfortable truths about their physical limitations and mental toughness. "Today we separate the pretenders from the performers," Reynolds announced, his voice carrying across the formation. "Some of you have been talking a good game for weeks. Some of you have been coasting on reputation and attitude. Today you prove what you are actually made of." His gaze lingered meaningfully on Elena, and she felt the familiar weight of his suspicion and hostility. Brandon noticed the attention and grinned with anticipation, sensing an opportunity to publicly humiliate his favorite target. The first group of recruits approached the starting line, including several of Brandon's followers who had spent weeks building him up as the unofficial leader of their class. Elena found herself in the second group, positioned directly behind Brandon, who had maneuvered to ensure maximum visibility for what he planned to be his moment of triumph. Brandon stretched ostentatiously, flexing his considerable muscles and playing to his audience of supporters. He had been a star athlete in high school, captain of both football and wrestling teams, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to physical dominance. "Watch and learn, princess," Brandon called over his shoulder to Elena. "This is what real strength looks like." The first group launched into the course with varying degrees of success. Most recruits struggled with the rope climb, their technique inefficient and energy-wasting. The tire run claimed several casualties as recruits stumbled over their own feet, and the wall scaling proved nearly impossible for anyone lacking upper body strength. Elena watched intently, not to admire the failures, but to analyze the obstacles and refine her approach. She noticed which techniques worked, where recruits lost time, and how momentum could be maintained or lost based on transition efficiency. Brandon's group took the line with confident aggression. He attacked the first obstacle with brute force, muscling his way over walls and through barriers with a kind of raw power that impressed spectators but wasted enormous amounts of energy. Initially, his approach seemed successful. Brandon pulled ahead of his group, his size and strength overwhelming obstacles that defeated smaller recruits. The crowd of waiting recruits cheered his progress, and he played to their attention with theatrical displays of effort. But the course was designed to break down even the strongest athletes through accumulated fatigue and technical challenges that could not be solved with strength alone. By the halfway point, Brandon's aggressive pace began to cost him dearly. His breathing became labored during the rope climb, his technique deteriorating as exhaustion set in. The tire run, which required precise foot placement and rhythm, tripped him up repeatedly as his legs grew heavy. By the time he reached the final wall scaling section, his earlier bravado had transformed into desperate gasping. Brandon finished the course but stumbled across the line, his face flushed red with exertion and his chest heaving. His time was respectable for a first attempt, but far from the dominating performance he had promised his supporters. Elena's group took position at the starting line as Brandon collapsed in the recovery area, still breathing heavily. She settled into a ready stance that looked almost relaxed, her mental preparation complete and her strategy finalized. The whistle blew, and Elena began her approach with fluid economy of movement. Where Brandon had used brute force, she employed technique. Where he had wasted energy on dramatic gestures, she maintained steady efficiency. Her rope climb was textbook perfect, using leg technique to preserve upper body strength. The tire run became a rhythmic dance of precise foot placement and maintained momentum. Each obstacle flowed seamlessly into the next without wasted motion or energy. Spectators began to take notice as Elena steadily gained ground on recruits who had started ahead of her. Her pace was sustainable and controlled, building rather than diminishing as the course progressed. Staff Sergeant Reynolds watched with growing amazement as Elena approached the final obstacles, still moving with the same controlled efficiency she had displayed at the beginning. Her breathing remained steady, her technique flawless, her mental focus absolute. She crossed the finish line with a time that shattered the existing course record by nearly 30 seconds. The silence from the spectator area was deafening as recruits struggled to process what they had witnessed. Brandon stared in disbelief, his face cycling through emotions of shock, anger, and humiliation. The performance gap was so significant that it demolished any remaining pretense about Elena's capabilities being merely adequate or lucky. "That is impossible," Brandon muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was undeniable, recorded officially, and witnessed by everyone present. The mess hall buzzed with conversation about Elena's record-breaking performance as recruits lined up for evening chow. Word had spread quickly through the battalion, and she found herself the subject of whispered discussions and speculative glances from recruits she had never spoken to directly. Elena moved through the serving line with quiet efficiency, accepting her meal tray and scanning the dining area for an isolated table where she could eat in peace. The attention made her uncomfortable, and she preferred the anonymity she had maintained during her first weeks of training. Brandon sat at his usual table, surrounded by his diminished circle of supporters, his face still flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. The obstacle course debacle had damaged his carefully constructed reputation, and he could feel his social authority slipping away with each conversation that focused on Elena's mysterious abilities. "She probably used steroids," Brandon said loudly, his voice carrying across nearby tables. "No way someone that size runs a course like that without chemical enhancement. They should test her blood." The suggestion was desperate and pathetic, but several recruits nodded along out of loyalty or their own discomfort with having their assumptions shattered so completely. Tommy Chun, sitting 3 tables away, shook his head in disgust at Brandon's increasingly unhinged behavior. David Restrepo, still nursing his ego from being repeatedly outmaneuvered during combat training, leaned forward eagerly. Maybe she had the course memorized somehow. Cheated the system with inside information. The conspiracy theories multiplied as Brandon's supporters struggled to reconcile Elena's performance with their need to believe in Brandon's superiority. Each explanation became more elaborate and less plausible, but they served the psychological purpose of maintaining comfortable illusions. Elena tried to ignore the conversations, focusing on her meal and the training manual she had brought to study during dinner. But Brandon's voice grew louder and more aggressive as he fed off the attention from his audience. "Look at her sitting over there acting all innocent," Brandon sneered, gesturing in Elena's direction with his fork, probably laughing at all of us for falling for her little mysterious act. "I bet that tattoo is not even real." The comment about her tattoo crossed a line that Elena had been careful to maintain throughout weeks of harassment. Her jaw tightened, and she looked up from her manual to meet Brandon's gaze directly across the dining area. The visual confrontation sent a ripple of tension through the mess hall as other recruits sensed the escalating conflict. Conversations quieted, and attention focused on the brewing confrontation between the 2 strongest personalities in their training class. Brandon stood up from his table, emboldened by the audience and driven by weeks of accumulated frustration. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet dining area. "You know what, Princess," Brandon called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm tired of your whole mysterious act. Why did not you tell everyone the truth about where that fake tattoo really came from?" Elena set down her fork carefully and stood to face him, her movements controlled but radiating a subtle danger that made nearby recruits instinctively lean back. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly across the silent mess hall. "My tattoo is not a topic for discussion, Kellerman." The formal use of his last name, delivered with unmistakable authority, caught Brandon off guard for a moment. But his anger and humiliation drove him forward into increasingly reckless territory. "Oh, we are back to the military speak again," Brandon laughed, but the sound was harsh and forced. "Tell me, where exactly did Daddy serve? What unit was he in?" What did he do that was so special it deserved a tattoo memorial? The questions hit Elena like physical blows, and several recruits noticed her hands clench into fists at her sides. Brandon had stumbled onto something significant, and her reaction only encouraged him to press harder. Or maybe Daddy was never in the military at all, Brandon continued, his voice rising with cruel satisfaction. Maybe you just picked some random military symbols and had them inked on your arm to look tough. Maybe you are nothing but a fraud. Tommy Chin started to stand, recognizing that Brandon had crossed into territory that was genuinely dangerous. But Zara grabbed his arm and shook her head. This was between Elena and Brandon now. An intervention would only make things worse. Elena took 3 steps toward Brandon's table, her movements so fluid and predatory that several recruits actually pushed back from their seats in alarm. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quality that none of them had heard before. "You do not know anything about my father," Elena said, each word precisely articulated and loaded with restrained fury. "You do not know what he sacrificed, what he gave up, or what he died for." The revelation that her father was dead sent a shock through the mess hall, but Brandon was too committed to his attack to recognize the dangerous ground he was treading. "Convenient story," Brandon sneered. "Dead father, mysterious military background, secret training that nobody can verify. Sounds like fiction to me." The explosion of violence happened so quickly that most recruits could not process the sequence of events until it was over. Elena moved with lethal precision that transformed her from quiet recruit to dangerous predator in the space of a heartbeat. Brandon never saw the first strike coming. Elena closed the distance between them in 2 fluid steps and delivered a palm strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping for air. Before he could recover, she had him face down on the mess hall floor with his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that made him cry out in pain. The entire confrontation lasted less than 5 seconds, but the implications would reverberate through the training battalion for weeks to come. Elena had moved with the kind of combat efficiency that came from years of advanced training, not the basic techniques taught to Marine recruits. "Stop!" Brandon gasped, his face pressed against the cold floor and his free hand slapping the ground in submission. "Stop, I give up." Elena held the position for 3 more seconds, her breathing controlled and her expression coldly focused. When she finally released him and stepped back, Brandon remained on the floor, his shoulder throbbing and his ego completely shattered. The mess hall was dead silent, except for Brandon's labored breathing and the distant sounds of kitchen activity. 50 recruits stared in shock at the demonstration of violence they had just witnessed, their comfortable assumptions about Elena's capabilities permanently destroyed. Staff Sergeant Reynolds burst through the mess hall doors, drawn by reports of a fight in progress. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in Brandon's prone position, Elena's composed stance, and a circle of stunned spectators surrounding them. "What the hell happened here?" Reynolds barked, his authority cutting through the shocked silence. Multiple recruits began talking at once, offering conflicting accounts and excited explanations. Reynolds silenced them with a gesture and pointed directly at Elena, who stood with her hands at her sides and her expression neutral. "Vasquez, explain yourself." Elena met his gaze steadily, showing no sign of the explosive violence she had displayed moments earlier. "Recruit Kellerman made inappropriate comments about my family, Staff Sergeant. I responded to defend their honor." The explanation was technically accurate, but deliberately understated the severity of both Brandon's provocation and Elena's response. Reynolds studied her carefully, recognizing trained combat technique when he witnessed it. That was not basic hand-to-hand combat, recruit. That was advanced close-quarters technique. Where exactly did you learn to fight like that? Elena maintained her composed demeanor despite the intensity of his scrutiny. "I have always taken self-defense seriously, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds turned to examine Brandon, who was struggling to sit up while nursing his injured shoulder. The recruit's face showed a mixture of pain, humiliation, and genuine fear that suggested he had encountered something far beyond his understanding. "Kellerman, what did you say to provoke this response?" Brandon looked around the mess hall desperately, seeking support from his former followers who now avoided his gaze with obvious discomfort. His social authority had been completely demolished, and he found himself isolated in a way he had never experienced before. "I was just asking questions about her tattoo," Brandon mumbled, his voice lacking any of its former confidence. She overreacted to normal conversation. Tom Eachin stood up from his table, unable to remain silent in the face of such obvious deception. "That is not what happened, Staff Sergeant. Kellerman was making accusations about her dead father and calling her a fraud." The revelation added context that made Reynolds reassess the situation entirely. Military families held sacred status in Marine Corps culture, and attacks on fallen service members crossed lines that justified significant retaliation. Zara Okafor nodded in agreement with Tommy's account. He was getting louder and more aggressive, Staff Sergeant. She tried to end the conversation several times before defending herself. Reynolds processed the witness statements while studying Elena with growing curiosity. Her technique had been too sophisticated for civilian self-defense training, too precise for lucky amateur fighting, and too controlled for emotional reaction. "Vasquez, report to my office at 2100 hours, Reynolds commanded. "We need to discuss your background in greater detail." Elena nodded respectfully, but showed no sign of concern about the coming interrogation. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds turned his attention to Brandon, who was finally managing to stand upright with assistance from nearby recruits. The formerly dominant recruit looked diminished and uncertain, his confidence completely shattered by the encounter. "Kellerman, you will report to medical for evaluation and then to my office at 2130. We will discuss appropriate conduct toward fellow Marines and their families." The formal use of the term Marines rather than recruits was significant, indicating that Reynolds now viewed the situation through the lens of military honor rather than training discipline. As the mess hall slowly returned to normal activity, Elena collected her tray and manual, preparing to leave as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But every recruit in the dining area watched her with new awareness and considerable respect. The quiet recruit with the mysterious tattoo had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous and capable than anyone had imagined. Elena knocked precisely 3 times on Staff Sergeant Reynolds' office door at exactly 2100 hours, her timing reflecting the military precision that had characterized her behavior throughout training. The administrative building was nearly empty at this hour, with only essential personnel maintaining their evening duties. "Enter," Reynolds called from inside. Elena stepped through the doorway and immediately snapped to attention, her posture textbook perfect, and her gaze focused on a point above Reynolds' head. The office was spartanly decorated with military regulations, unit photographs, and commendation certificates that spoke to Reynolds' long career. "Recruit Vasquez reporting as ordered, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds studied her for a long moment without speaking, his experienced eyes taking in details that most observers would miss. Her bearing was flawless, her uniform immaculate, and her composure absolute despite the circumstances that had brought her to his office. "At ease, recruit," Reynolds said finally. "Take a seat." Elena moved to the chair positioned in front of his desk, her movements economical and controlled. She sat with perfect posture, hands resting naturally on her thighs, and waited for Reynolds to begin his investigation. Reynolds opened a manila folder containing Elena's enlistment records and began flipping through the standardized forms that documented her civilian background. The paperwork painted a picture of an unremarkable young woman from Arizona with no prior military experience or family connections to the armed forces. "According to your enlistment documentation, you have no military background whatsoever," Reynolds began, his tone neutral but probing. "No family members in service, no JROTC participation, no formal combat training of any kind." Elena maintained her composed expression while confirming the accuracy of her official records. "That is correct, Staff Sergeant." Reynolds closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his skepticism obvious. "Then explain to me how a recruit with no military background demonstrates advanced close-quarters combat techniques that I have only seen from special operations personnel." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that could affect Elena's entire military career. She had anticipated this moment since her first day of training, knowing that her abilities would eventually draw scrutiny from experienced instructors. I have always been interested in self-defense and physical fitness, Staff Sergeant. I pursued training opportunities whenever possible. Reynolds made a dismissive sound that indicated his dissatisfaction with the evasive response. That was not recreational self-defense, Vasquez. That was military-grade combatives executed with the precision of someone who has trained under qualified instructors for years. Elena felt the familiar tension that accompanied questions about her background, but she maintained her military bearing while considering how much truth she could safely reveal. Before she could formulate a response, Reynolds' desk phone rang with a sharp electronic tone that demanded immediate attention. He glanced at the caller identification display, and his expression shifted to one of surprise and curiosity. "Reynolds here," he answered, his voice taking on the respectful tone reserved for senior officers. Elena could hear only one side of the conversation, but Reynolds' increasingly formal posture suggested he was speaking with someone of significant rank and importance. "Yes, sir. She's here in my office right now." "Yes, sir, I understand. I will escort her personally." Reynolds hung up the phone and studied Elena with new interest, as if seeing her for the first time. The phone call had clearly changed the dynamics of their meeting in ways that Elena could not yet understand. "Change of plans, Vasquez. You were requested for an immediate meeting with a visiting officer, someone who apparently knows more about your background than your enlistment records indicate." Elena felt a chill of apprehension mixed with recognition. There were very few people who could connect her current identity with her carefully guarded past, and most of those connections involved memories she preferred to keep buried. Reynolds stood and gestured toward the door. "Follow me, recruit. And Vasquez, whatever this meeting reveals about your background, I suggest you start being more forthcoming about your capabilities and training." They walked through the quiet corridors of the administrative building, their footsteps echoing off polished floors and institutional walls. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, trying to prepare for a confrontation she had hoped to avoid throughout her military service. The conference room they entered was larger and more formal than Reynolds' office, with a polished table surrounded by chairs and military protocol displays covering the walls. At the head of the table sat a man in navy dress blues, his uniform displaying rank insignia and ribbons that spoke to distinguished service in special operations. Commander Marcus Torres was exactly as Elena remembered him from her childhood: tall, lean, with intelligent eyes and the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of dangerous missions. His presence in this room meant that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to be permanently destroyed. Elena snapped to attention with automatic precision, but her breathing had become slightly uneven as suppressed memories threatened to overwhelm her composure. Commander Torres studied her face with the intensity of someone comparing present reality with distant recollections. When he spoke, his voice carried warmth mixed with professional authority. "Hello, Elena. You have grown up quite a bit since I last saw you." Commander Torres gestured for Elena to take a seat across from him, while Staff Sergeant Reynolds remained standing near the door, his expression shifting between confusion and growing understanding as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Elena sat with perfect military bearing, but those who knew her well would have noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way her breathing had become more controlled, as if she were preparing for an emotional assault rather than a simple conversation. "Staff Sergeant Reynolds," Commander Torres began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing classified information. "What I am about to tell you regarding Recruit Vasquez's background is sensitive in nature and directly relevant to her performance during training." Reynolds nodded respectfully, sensing that he was about to learn something that would completely reframe his understanding of the quiet recruit who had puzzled him for weeks. Commander Torres turned his attention to Elena, his weathered features softening with a mixture of pride and sadness that spoke to deep personal connection and painful memories. "Elena, I knew your father from the time you were 7 years old. Master Chief Petty Officer Ricardo Vasquez was my teammate, my friend, and one of the finest warriors I ever had the privilege to serve alongside. The formal acknowledgement of her father's identity and rank hit Elena like a physical blow, and she closed her eyes briefly as suppressed emotions threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Reynolds felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically as Commander Torres continued with details that cast Elena's mysterious competence in an entirely new light. Ricardo trained you from childhood in advanced combat techniques, marksmanship, tactical thinking, and military protocol. You essentially received the equivalent of special operations education from one of the most decorated SEALs in naval special warfare history. Elena's hands clenched into fists on the table surface as memories flooded back. Endless hours of training in their backyard, patient instruction in weapons handling, tactical scenarios played out like elaborate games that were actually sophisticated military education. Commander Torres reached into his briefcase and withdrew a photograph that he placed on the table between them. The image showed a younger version of Elena, perhaps 12 years old, standing beside a tall man in navy dress blues whose chest was covered with ribbons and commendations. This was taken at Ricardo's promotion ceremony to Master Chief, Commander Torres explained. Elena was so proud of her father that day. She insisted on getting a tattoo to match his unit insignia when she turned 18, against her mother's wishes but with Ricardo's blessing. Staff Sergeant Reynolds moved closer to examine the photograph, his expression showing dawning recognition as he compared the military insignia in the image to the tattoo he had dismissed as decorative artwork. The tattoo on Elena's arm was not generic military imagery chosen for appearance. It was a precise replica of her father's SEAL team insignia, complete with unit number, deployment dates, and Latin motto that held sacred meaning for the warriors who had earned the right to wear it. Ricardo died in Afghanistan 6 months before Elena enlisted. Commander Torres continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss. He was leading a rescue operation for captured Marines when his position was overrun. He stayed behind to ensure his team could extract the wounded, and he held off enemy forces until air support could arrive. Elena's shoulders began to shake slightly as the full story emerged. Years of suppressed grief and pride mixing with the exhaustion of maintaining her secret throughout weeks of harassment and mockery. Commander Torres stood and moved around the table to place a supportive hand on Elena's shoulder. Ricardo received the Navy Cross posthumously for his actions that day. He saved 17 Marines and 4 fellow SEALs through his sacrifice. Staff Sergeant Reynolds felt a wave of shame wash over him as he recalled his weeks of dismissive treatment toward Elena and his assumptions about her military-themed tattoo. He had been mocking the daughter of a decorated war hero, a young woman carrying the weight of extraordinary loss and legacy. Elena finally looked up, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady when she spoke. He made me promise to serve with honor and never use his reputation as a crutch. He wanted me to earn my own place in the Corps through merit, not through sympathy for being his daughter. Commander Torres nodded with understanding and respect. That sounds exactly like Ricardo. He was always more concerned with character than recognition, more focused on service than personal glory. The room fell silent as the implications of Elena's revelation settled over the 3 military personnel. Her exceptional performance, her mysterious competence, her defensive reaction to mockery of her tattoo, all made perfect sense within the context of her true background. Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice carrying new respect when he addressed Elena directly. Recruit Vasquez, I owe you an apology for my assumptions and treatment. Your father's sacrifice honors every Marine who has ever worn the uniform. Elena wiped her eyes and returned to military bearing, but the emotional weight had been lifted by finally sharing the truth she had carried alone for so long. The formation of 50 recruits stood at perfect attention on the parade ground as Commander Torres prepared to address them about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of military service. Word had spread quickly through the battalion about Elena's background, transforming her from mysterious outsider to revered legacy warrior overnight. Elena stood in the front rank, her tattooed forearm visible and proud rather than hidden beneath long sleeves. The insignia that had drawn mockery and suspicion for weeks now commanded absolute respect from every recruit who understood its sacred significance. Brandon Kellerman stood 3 positions to her right, his face showing genuine remorse and shame for his weeks of harassment toward the daughter of a fallen hero. The revelation of Elena's true identity had shattered not just his arrogance, but his entire understanding of judgment and assumption. Commander Torres stepped forward, his dress blue uniform gleaming in the morning sun and his ribbons telling the story of decades spent in the most dangerous corners of the world. When he spoke, his voice carried across the formation with absolute authority. Today I want to tell you about Master Chief Petty Officer Ricardo Vasquez, a warrior who exemplified everything we hope to achieve through military service. He was a husband, a father, a teacher, and ultimately a hero who gave his life so that others could return home to their families. Torres gestured toward Elena with obvious pride and respect. Ricardo's daughter Elena carries his legacy not through privilege or special treatment, but through the values he instilled in her from childhood. Honor, sacrifice, competence, and absolute dedication to the mission above personal recognition. Staff Sergeant Reynolds stood at the edge of the formation, his earlier skepticism completely transformed into admiration for both Elena's capabilities and her character in maintaining anonymity despite weeks of undeserved harassment. Commander Torres continued his address, his words carrying the weight of personal experience and genuine emotion. Ricardo trained Elena in advanced tactics, marksmanship, and combat techniques, not because he wanted to create a warrior, but because he wanted to prepare her for a life of service to something greater than herself. Elena felt tears threatening, but maintained her military bearing as the commander shared details about her father's final mission and ultimate sacrifice. The story was both heartbreaking and inspiring, painting a picture of courage under impossible circumstances. Ricardo held his position for 47 minutes against overwhelming enemy forces, Torres explained. He used every technique, every tactical principle, and every ounce of skill he possessed to ensure his team could complete their rescue mission and extract safely. The formation listened in complete silence, understanding that they were receiving a lesson in heroism that would stay with them throughout their military careers and beyond. Commander Torres turned his attention back to Elena, his voice filled with warmth and paternal pride. Elena chose to honor her father's memory not by seeking recognition or special treatment, but by earning her place through merit and proving herself worthy of the legacy she carries. The ceremony concluded with Commander Torres presenting Elena with her father's Navy Cross, which had been held in trust until she completed her initial military training. The medal represented not just Ricardo's heroism, but Elena's successful journey from anonymous recruit to respected Marine. As the formation dispersed, Elena found herself surrounded by fellow recruits who approached with genuine respect and apology for their earlier treatment. Brandon was among the first, his usual arrogance replaced by humility and shame. "Elena," Brandon said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect for everything you have endured and accomplished. Your father would be proud of the Marine you have become." Elena accepted his words with grace, understanding that his harassment had come from ignorance rather than malice. She had learned from her father that true strength included the ability to forgive and move forward without carrying the burden of past grievances. Tommy Chun and Zura Okafor approached together, both showing the kind of genuine friendship that Elena had rarely experienced during her military training. They had suspected there was more to her story, but the full revelation exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The weeks that followed transformed Elena's entire training experience. She emerged as a natural leader, her tactical knowledge and combat skills serving to elevate the performance of every recruit around her. The harassment and isolation were replaced by respect and camaraderie. Her tattoo became a source of inspiration rather than mockery, reminding everyone who saw it that military service was about sacrifice, honor, and commitment to ideals greater than individual ambition. Elena graduated from basic training as the honor graduate of her class. But more importantly, she had proven herself worthy of the legacy her father had left behind. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about what resonated most with you, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when it mattered most. Sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest burdens and the greatest courage.